Labour has some claim to progressive domestic record, and that's best symbolised by the welfare state. However, its commitment to progressive international policy is more questionable. When in opposition, Labour has often positioned itself against Western militarism. Yet in government, its record includes wars in the Middle East, unquestioned support for the United States, and a commitment to Britain's nuclear arsenal. With Jeremy Corbyn due to speak at the largest anti-nuclear demo in a generation, we'll ask, can Labour ever be a vehicle for a progressive foreign policy? I'm Michael Walker, this is The Fix. Joining me to discuss UK foreign policy and the left are Meera Sabaratnam, lecturer in international relations at SOAS and a contributor to The Disorder of Things. Luke Cooper, a lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University and a convener of Another Europe is Possible, the left-in campaign for the EU referendum. Musab Younis, who's a PhD student at Oxford and a teaching fellow at SOAS. And Maia, who's a lecturer in international relations at Oxford Brookes. First, here's the newsreel.
Despite the formal collapse of the British Empire, Britain has continued to deploy military and economic force overseas. In the 1950s, interventions in Iran and Egypt showed Britain's willingness to use military power to protect its business interests. Now tied to the US and NATO, Britain has been instrumental in defending a global order dominated by the West. Such policies have been common to both Tory and Labour governments. From Wilson's support for the Vietnam War to Blair's invasion of Iraq, the Labour Party has been complicit in the death of millions in the global south. These policies have not gone uncontested within the Labour Party. In 1983, following a sharp turn to the left, Labour's election manifesto called for unilateral nuclear disarmament and the phasing out of NATO. Yet they were crushed at the polls, as Thatcher's victory in the Falklands War a year earlier eclipsed Labour's internationalism. With the election of Jeremy Corbyn, Labour is again led by a committed peace campaigner. Despite vocal opposition from the British media and his own MPs, his positions on foreign policy retain strong support from his left-wing base.
We're going to begin our discussion with the 1-minute round, where each guest has 60 seconds to answer the same question. Today, I'd like our guest to give us some historical background. So Meera, you're up first. What have been the major trends in UK foreign policy over the past decades? And what has motivated the actions of the British state abroad? 60 seconds.
I think the UK has been motivated by this core idea that it's part of the West, and being part of the West is how it judges what its security priorities are, how it judges what it's going to do economically, how it sees itself politically. So it tells us who our mates are, who our enemies are, and what we should do about that. And I would say the overarching objective of that foreign policy has been to maintain supremacy for part of the Western bloc, either in the sense of the Cold War, in the sense of the EU, in terms of how capitalism is organised. The UK has been contributing on all those fronts. In security terms, it's clear that the UK's identity has been quite consistent over time. It's seen itself as a liberal power, spreading democracy, spreading human rights in that sense, and what it's tended to do is export that through multiple mechanisms. It's also been a key part of the EU in that project of European integration, particularly during the Cold War.
Thank you, Meera. Luke, your turn.
I suppose Meera has been talking more about the long-term geopolitical alignments of the UK internationally. I think if we're moving to the post-Cold War era, into the 1990s, and in terms of the discussion we're going to have today about the Labour Party and how it situates itself in UK foreign policy, I think New Labour was fundamental to the cultural imagination of the 1990s. This was a time where the discourse that emerged is very interventionist, So we have this idea of the US in particular in this unipolar moment where the United States has this unique position as a single hegemon internationally, and that it would bring about cultural and economic integration, and as part of that, a intervention into, quote unquote, the world's trouble spots. So for New Labour, they got on board with that liberal imagination, and I think out of time.
Brilliant.
We'll talk more
Thanks,
in a
Luke.
moment.
Discussing the discourses that justify the sort of foreign policies Meera's been talking about. Musab, your 60 seconds.
I want to start by kind of mentioning there's a quotation by Winston Churchill addressing his cabinet in 1914, And I think in a way it kind of summarises UK foreign policy perfectly over a long period. So what Churchill says to his cabinet, and I'm going to paraphrase, but I'd encourage people to go and check the quotation online, it's easily accessible. He says, we're not a young nation, we've been around for a while, and we've acquired for ourselves a disproportionate share of the world's wealth. And then he adds, that was acquired through violence. And the fact that we want to, he says, now we want to sit back and enjoy our vast and splendid possessions. That's the quotation. And not everyone is in agreement with that. Therefore, we need to kind of arrange our policy around that. So I think, although traditionally people kind of tend to posit this big break between colonialism and post-colonialism, we actually see very many continuities in terms of how British policy engages with the outside world based on this fact.
Brilliant, Musab. And Maia, you're last.
Thank
60
you.
seconds.
I would like to talk, to focus more on international treaties and organisations, because I think it links nicely to what Musab was saying in terms of the link between colonial and post-colonial, and to think of actual the legal strategies that the UK has been involved in, specifically since the 1970s. And so there are obviously an explosion of international organisations and treaties which have developed a lot in terms of economic agreements, free trade agreements, which have exploded since NAFTA, which was the big North American free trade agreement, but now we're signing at the moment, negotiating TTIP, the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. But we've also obviously a leading role in NATO, so a military organisation, regional organisation, which links back to what Meera was saying about the Cold War, and we'll maybe come back to that. But today, what is the role of NATO? So to finish, I would want to talk about the paradox, basically, of this political nationalism, the focus on sovereignty versus economic liberalism, and the various means we have to that.
Brilliant, Maia, thank you. What we're going to talk about now is the relationship of the left, and especially the establishment left, to the elements of foreign policy our guests have described so far. Musab, you introduced the colonial legacy. The Labour Party were founded in 1900 in the heyday of empire. They were in government numerous times before the empire's collapse. What was Labour's relationship to empire?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting question, because at the time of the foundation of the Labour Party, there was a lot of optimism both in the colonies and amongst the left within Europe that Labour was going to effect a real change and revolution in colonial policy. One thing that we can clearly see is that that didn't happen, and in fact the kind of whatever socialist elements there were to the Labour Party, which kind of weren't necessarily there at the early stages anyway, didn't necessarily bleed through into foreign policy. So one of the things we saw, the first Labour minority government in 1924, the first time there was a Labour Prime Minister, and what happened was Labour continued repression in India, which included shooting at strikers, repressing newspapers, throwing political prisoners into prison for long periods of time. It continued Churchill's bombing campaign in Iraq. And one of the things that we see is that the idea that Labour is going to continue imperial foreign policy the way it had been.
Is that an example of an idealistic party selling out, or would you never have even expected it from a Labour government, that they might have changed course from Conservative policy?
I think there's an element of just common sense that's going on here, that there's a fundamental common sense about who Britain is, what its place in the world is, that isn't even subject to political discussion because it's just embedded. Britain is advanced, it is liberal, it is progressive, and so it assumes that everything that it is doing is all of those things. Now, Labour were not necessarily, the mainstream of the Labour Party was not necessarily in a position to unpick that, even though loads of activists who were fighting against colonialism pointed out that they were hypocritical, pointed out that, you know, they did loads of terrible things, pointed out quite presciently that colonialism was going to end in fascism and that they were very closely connected, but that wasn't in the mainstream
What kind of
discussion.
activism are we talking here? Could I?
Yeah, so, well,
Or
there was
who are
obviously
the agents here?
Yeah, so I think you can see lots of different sources. You can see uprisings in the colonies in terms of in India, obviously throughout the 19th century. That's a very tense period where people are contesting British rule. You see it in Ireland. You see the Pan-African movement taking shape in the West Indies and in America. And people are really starting at the fringes of this conversation to reconceive what the international looks like. But the domestic Labour Party is not necessarily receptive to taking that on board.
But I think you posed the question in the right way, because Britain in the early 20th century is an organically nationalist society. So for a party like Labour to become a party of government in the UK, I mean, it had to express really a British national colonial interest.
To get elected, or it had to because that was their ideology?
I think they
anyway?
were reflecting a nationalism that's present in British society generally. So it's interesting that activists in the Labour Party and also in the socialist parties internationally before the First World War were more consciously anti-colonial, more consciously internationalist, but at the same time they were operating within very nationalist communities. So they had to negotiate that tension, and they weren't able to successfully
One of the things I would add here is just to say that there was it was not simply a kind of natural nationalism which manifested itself, but actively marginalising dissident voices within the party who were very prominent. And up until the 30s, when the ILP was affiliated, that was the Independent Labour Party, very actively involved in anti-colonial movements. So the other discourse was there, and some of them were Labour MPs and were involved in propagating that, but they were shut out from the upper echelons of the Labour Party deliberately.
But that period as well, in any case, of beginning of the 20th century, there's still an idea of the civilizing mission, and there's a belief that international institutions, which have really started to proliferate by the kind of mid to late 19th century, the Red Cross, we have beginning of international conferences, conventions being signed, and there's still a general belief, a sense of kind of, this liberal internationalism that, and Wilson's 14 points, I mean, we have this whole kind of the beginning of international relations as we kind of teach it, but there is a kind of positive optimism about the ability of states to build an international society, as it were, in the West anyway, bar all these other movements. It's also a way to suppress these movements and to kind of keep, the lid on the international structures of governance. So we're in a very different position today, clearly, from that. So we need to reflect on that. But there's a lot of solidarity, international solidarity, that we need to go back to. And
that dichotomy between the liberal element and the colonial element, I think, is really strong as well to work that through. Because, at the end of the 1920s, Britain was organising conferences with Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, to have political unification in the British Empire of the white settler colonies. So there was actually
how far did that project go?
As we know from history, it didn't happen for various reasons. So anyway, we have that tension between the liberal element that's emergent and a backlash against it through the colonial element that's very strong. And so you got the turn to colonialism in Africa as a response, in some ways an intensification, particularly in the 1930s. The colonial empire became more and more important to British economic interests because the world was in a massive depression.
Is this still? Are we talking about the past now, or do we think this is something that's still relevant in the present colonialism? Is this all history, or is there?
A lot of the structures that were developed during the colonial period, if we just think about who in the world makes stuff and who they sell it to, clearly patterns of trade established through colonialism go on today. I mean, and it's not the case that colonialism was the only way forward. If we think about the way in which the textile industry developed, this is an interesting case study. So there was a massive textile industry in India prior to British colonialism, and Indians made the most cloth. The British had a policy of actively deindustrialising India in order to allow the industrialisation in the north of England to flourish and for textiles to be manufactured there. And so India was relegated to producing the cotton and producing the dyes that would go into the final manufactures. But it had prior capacity.
Well, that's also something that exists now, right?
So I think sorry, can I just chip in there? Well, it's really important to there's kind of two levels to this. One is what sometimes is called neo-colonialism, but ways in which Britain is trying to maintain the gap between rich and poor, which was developed during the colonial era. So the great divergence, which happens in the 19th century between the rich world and the poor world, Britain has consistently throughout the 20th century and now the 21st tried to maintain that and has resisted attempts at global wealth redistribution. And then the second element to that is resisting attempts to redress colonial grievances. So we see that now with the Caribbean countries trying to put proposals through for reparations, Britain won't even have the discussion with them. Even though they're saying it's non-binding, can we just talk about it in the UN? Britain won't talk about that.
To bring this back to the left and the relationship to our foreign policy or international policy, was this ever something mentioned within the Labour Party or within the Social Democratic parties of the West?
Oh no, I mean, because people are still tied to this idea of national interest, right? What is right and what is best for British workers, not workers generally or people generally. And that reflects a real tension in how political societies are organised, right? We are organised as a national democracy, right? Vote in national elections and so on. So people's consciousness is very much about what they can achieve within their nation states. Even if you take away, you know, all the other ideas about nationalism being a myth, people are still organisationally tied to the nation state. And so all of this stuff about alternative modalities of globalisation, people are not going to be able to engage in the same conversation. Because
people are discussing about capitalism in the way they never did before. Sure. I mean, people, you know, that are questioning the structures and seeing it as a structure that goes beyond borders. And that's a new discourse.
In the next part of the show, we'll discuss Jeremy Corbyn's relation to international affairs. But first, let's take a look at him discuss intervention in Syria last November.
If we bomb in Raqqa, we're actually going to take out civilian lives. We may not, in effect, do very much damage to ISIL and actually may make the situation worse, not better. The experience of Libya, where there was no follow-up plan, shows that these things can be very dangerous. I think what will help to solve the problem are two things. One is the political process, which is encouraging but very slow, what's happened in Vienna. But the other one is cutting off arms, oil sales and money to ISIL. That is an area that I think no government has done enough on. An act of violence, an act of war is absolutely a very last resort. You basically don't bring about peace by bombing. You bring about peace by all the other processes, particularly the political process.
So we've seen Corbyn speak out against bombing in Syria. It's now his opposition to Trident that's making the headlines. Musab, do these policies form part of a broader narrative on foreign policy?
Yeah, I think they do, and I think it's important to understand this. You have to understand where Corbyn comes from. He comes from the left of the Labour Party, which really is associated with the independent Labour Party, and its position has always been to recognise that Britain is always intervening in the world as this very powerful imperial state, and to do what it can to try and reduce the harm that Britain is causing around the world. And I think it's essentially this kind of harm reduction theory that Corbyn is trying to develop into a cohesive foreign policy.
Yeah, I agree that he's coming very much from that distant tradition within the Labour Party, and it's interesting that this is what it's the foreign policy issues that are the most controversial in terms of the willingness of the Parliamentary Labour Party to accept them. And I think that reflects what we were talking about earlier in terms of the strategic symmetry between British imperial, colonial, national interest and the Labour Party historically. I would just add, in terms of the footage we were looking at earlier, I mean, I just add a slight note of caution in terms of the politics of that dissident tradition, which I basically support. You know, I don't think Corbyn's guilty of this, but there is sometimes an enemy of my enemy is my friend problem. And I think in terms of his position on Syria, it smacks slightly of naivety at times, i.e. how can you have a political solution with Assad murdering his own people?
But I think how can you have a military solution unless you know who you want to win? In that sense, Corbyn's call for a political process is quite sensible. I mean, if you're going to bomb people, you better know who you're going to bomb and what you want the end result to be. If you've got a successful, I mean, putting aside the human suffering elements, you need to have a clear idea of who you want to win the war and then bomb to help them win the war. In that sense, it's got to be partisan. You can't just randomly bomb people who are doing bad things, because then you bomb everybody and then the war, you know, in some sense continues unless you literally kill everyone. So in that sense, there is a political logic to what he's saying, which I think is sound. And in that sense, it overlaps a little bit with a broader scepticism about the utility of force in conflicts, particularly today's conflicts, which are complicated and they've got lots of different players in. Retired army generals have made the same case that a lot of the things going on in the Middle East can't be solved militarily because it's too complicated, because force can be wielded by lots of different people.
I mean, it's interesting you say the military establishment are also making those arguments, because at least in that clip, he's not making a specifically leftist critique of bombing Syria. It's the more an isolationist one in a way, which is if we interfere, it could go wrong. There might be more harm than good. Is it distinctive enough what he's saying?
Well, on one level, sorry.
Oh no, go on.
I was going to say on one level, it's an important argument to keep making because the knee-jerk reaction we see, particularly in the US, is that if something bad is happening, the answer is bombing. And actually, this is a stupid idea line is incredibly important to keep bringing up. So it's not just a war is bad.
It's a simple line, but it's a good one.
War is stupid.
I think one of the things he's not saying that he potentially could be saying here is that Britain isn't actually coming from a neutral position when you look at the Middle East and Syria. In fact, we are supporting ongoing interventions, particularly with huge arms deals to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, since it is now involved in the civil war in Yemen, which the UN says now potentially the world's worst humanitarian crisis, economic blockade, famine-like conditions, and Britain has sold Saudi Arabia £3 billion worth of arms since that intervention started. We're also supporting ongoing repression in Bahrain and Egypt through arms sales and diplomatic and political support. So we don't come from a position of neutrality here.
I mean, that could be seen as one of the successes of Corbyn's leadership so far, that relationship with Saudi Arabia has started to be questioned. But he could maybe push it forward, Maia?
Yeah, no, I think there is something very encouraging in the sense that Corbyn, became popular on a very principled stance on a particular foreign policy positions, and that is encouraging for us generally, on the UK and on the left particularly. I mean, if we compare to Sanders in the US, which is interesting in terms of somebody who's quite similar, but not so strong on foreign policy issues, although that might be slightly changing in the next few weeks. But in the sense, two similar political actors, but playing with these international issues differently.
I mean,
and to come back to this point about militarization, I mean, if we talk about the migrants issue as well, and the role of the military and of organizations such as Frontex, agencies, security agencies, basically, policing now migrants and closing borders. I mean, so, we shouldn't just look at the actual foreign intervention, but actually policing and militarization more generally.
I'm glad you brought up popularity as well, because even though it did him well in the leadership election, in terms of the nation at large, these issues haven't been serving him so well. I've got results here. In December, it was found that 71% of the public did not trust Corbyn with national security. And in last month, he had a net approval rating of -39, 63% of respondents saying he's doing a bad job as leader of the Labour Party. Is there some failure of communication going on here, or is it just that the UK will never support the kind of foreign policies that we seem to be fairly supportive of?
It's not failure of communication. It's an active campaign, isn't it?
I think there have been some failings of communication, haven't there? I mean,
well, it's an active campaign, but we can't just rely on. Obviously, the media is at fault, but we've got to take them as a given, right? If we want to win, we've got to take as a given that the Sun will be there.
One of the strategic problems that he has, it's really hard that you just expect Britain's place in the world that we've been talking about. You're kind of expected to have solutions, to go back to Syria and stuff. I mean, it's difficult. Like, you're expected as the leader of the Labour Party to promote a solution to the Syrian crisis. Unfortunately, not all political problems have solutions, but he's expected to promote one, and his solution is a political process, but
which is a bit vague.
Very vague, and if it doesn't include Assad leaving power, then it's not a just settlement for the Syrian people.
But I think what he's saying is, first we need to make sure we don't make the situation worse. The current proposals, in his view, look likely to make the situation worse. So I think it's only incoherent if you come from a position that not making the situation worse is somehow a bad thing, whereas it seems to me that, of course, that should always be the kind of principle that you begin with. One of the things I think it's important to understand is that Jeremy Corbyn comes from outside what you might call an establishment view of foreign policy, and that includes the kind of liberal imperialist establishment of the left and the Labour Party traditionally. That means it's going to be much harder to convince the press and the public who've been told that there is a particular range of options available. Corbyn is saying something outside of that range of options. Now, I think that means there needs to be a very concerted effort to convince the public on these issues. We know that people's opinions have changed over time. When you look at something like Trident, opposition to Trident has consistently risen. The CND is experiencing a resurgence right now. It is possible to change people's minds on foreign policy issues, but you need to try and communicate with them. And that doesn't just mean using the mainstream media. I think it means using as many possible kind of range of options as you have available to you. I don't think that's been happening.
And he's
Like
been
this.
doing that with the use of the internet and various polls.
Yeah.
And
I think luckily we're running out of time. Well, not luckily we're running out of time, but we're running out of time. But luckily, our final question is very related to what you're saying. It's a difficult one, but you seem to have some of the answers. Maya, I'll begin with you. 60 seconds. Can there be a genuinely left-wing and successful foreign policy? And what strategies should we adopt to bring it about? 60 seconds.
I'll come back firstly maybe to the point I made originally in terms of trying to rethink foreign policy away from these national, international distinctions, which mean nothing in practice. You know, we don't live in a bordered world in that sense. And there's this illusion, this rhetoric of sovereignty that's being constantly reproduced. And so we need to think internationalism for itself, not in relation to the national interest. And because that's meaningless in any case. I think there also needs to be more focus on campaigning against neoliberal free trade agreements such as TTIP. This is fun, and Labour has, I think Corbyn is against TTIP, but it's a bit vague in terms of the Labour Party and its strategy towards that. The Labour Party is supportive of the agreement, negotiated under specific terms. So that I would like to see a much stronger position against these economic processes and these different layers of jurisdiction, basically, and against emergency laws happening across Europe, which are very frightening.
Yeah, really good. I think interesting, it's suggesting almost having a foreign policy can be a losing game, and that you want to change the terms of debate, have an international policy. Musab, your 60 seconds.
Yeah, so there's always going to be a tension with the left in terms of its internationalist principles and history and the state system and running a nation state. Of course, the left has traditionally seen states as problematic, generating their own dynamics of power, domination, and the rest of it. And so in that sense, I don't think you can do away with the tension, but you can have better and worse policies. Social democratic left in Europe doesn't have a great record on this. Unfortunately, the nationalism, the idea of maintaining wealth disparities and maintaining European primacy has taken precedence over what you might see as an internationalist heritage. But we have seen policies that have been much better than, say, what we've ever seen in the UK. Sweden in the 60s under Olof Palme engaged in a very vigorous support for third world resistance movements, opposed apartheid South Africa, opposed the Vietnam War, and it maintained that policy for a long time. And I don't see any reason why that isn't possible in the UK. With concerted effort and organisation, we could shift our policy towards something like that, much more progressive.
Good, and some hope there that a left government could potentially change something slightly for the better. Luke, your 60 seconds.
Yep, well, I would reject the term foreign policy. I think that it is basically, when you talk about the foreign, it's a type of human self-alienation. You're dividing the human community up on national lines in a way that's regressive. I think we should talk about international policy, about global policy. I think if you think about it in those terms, then you start to include things like social justice, climate justice, workers' protection across borders. These are things that are relevant to the upcoming EU referendum, of course. So I think if we want to have a politics beyond the nation state, we have to be very, very careful in seeing, opposed to seeing a British exit from the European Union as some way, a path towards a more social and progressive Europe. So I would want to see, yes, breaking with TTIP. Labour MEPs and Green Party MEPs are doing lots of work in the European Parliament to oppose it. So we have to use those institutions to confront those policies.
Meera, your 60 seconds.
So there's lots of small things that Labour could do to move things along. I agree that the major tensions are problematic, this divide between the national and the international, even the idea of the national interest as being somehow a coherent thing. In some sense, Corbyn can't move with that broad issue. But what they can do is push for things like fairer trade, less hypocritical agreements in the international sphere on things like food policy, on things like worker movement, on things like entitlement to receive benefits and so on in terms of migrant communities. Britain has a lot of asymmetric relationships, and making them more symmetrical so that recognition and responsibilities are shared is really important. I think on the there's a specific issue around international development, and that really means Britain getting its own house in order before it pushes other countries to make reforms that it would itself never actually implement, and that's absolutely key to gaining respect and solidarity.
Thanks, Meera. That was a brilliant 60 seconds, and thanks everyone for your contributions. We've covered a lot in this show: Labour's relationship to the Empire in the United States, the strengths and weaknesses of Corbyn's foreign policy, and whether foreign policy is even a useful concept itself. Thanks for watching. You can follow us on Twitter at @thefix_TV, like us on Facebook at @thefixtv, and of course, follow us on Novara Media to catch our next episode in 3 weeks' time. See you then.